As a person and as a parent, I'm very worried about the climate change challenge. And I'm not a climate scientist, I'm an economist. And so many people right now in the Biden administration and around the world are talking about the challenge of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And I take that very seriously. I want the world to decarbonize. I support much of what President Biden is up to in this Green New Deal. As an economist, I want to know its price tag. But even if the US succeeds in decarbonizing, I believe that greenhouse gas emissions are going to continue to rise because of energy demand in the developing world. It makes thinking about adaptation essential. And adaptation is basically, can we take a punch as Mother Nature throws harder punches? Are we going to get better? And so, what my book is about is the microeconomics of adapting to climate change. In writing this book, I'm a little bit of a bad boy of making the case of some of the benefits of capitalism that others haven't fully explored. And so if I had to turn my book into a bumper sticker, the book is about how capitalism helps us to adapt to climate change. Bald men feel that they have a problem. They don't want to be bald, and so they demand Rogaine, and pharmaceutical companies dream that up and have made billions selling that to guys. In a similar sense, if we worry that California is going to face drought, if we worry that California is going to face wildfires, what are ways that people can continue to thrive in California? And so the big point that I want folks watching this clip to think about is that we're not passive victims. A key idea in economics is rational choice, that we have some control over our lives. And if we sense that we are in danger, whether the danger is terrorism, whether it's COVID, whether it's climate change, to protect our families and our loved ones, we're going to use all the strategies we have available to us. So let's talk through the wildfires, because this is a crucial issue. And we in California are going to face more and more wildfire risk. So a couple of points that I'd like folks to think about. Why is anyone living in the fire zone? So a point that Enrico Moretti and other urban scholars have made is an unintended consequence of San Francisco and Los Angeles not building up much housing in the city's core area is to actually push people out into the wildfire zone. So an idea I talk about in my book is that we need to change our zoning rules. As we learn from climate scientists, where is higher ground in terms of sea level rise? As we learn about where are fire zones, where are and where aren't fire zones within our state, we need to change our zoning codes to build up, to build taller buildings where it's relatively safer. And that's a way for middle class people to afford housing. The market economist in me thinks that if millions of homes face fire risk, we're going to see a couple of adaptive responses. We're going to see people wanting to live in safer structures. The insurance industry is going to be less willing to insure properties that face increased risk. And so in my work on adapting to climate change, I come back to this cliche, who's the adult in the room? If the insurance industry says to homeowners who live in fire zones, we're going to charge you a fortune for insurance if you don't take these precautions, that's a strong incentive for homeowners to take precautions like cleaning up vegetation and building the home out of materials that are less flame sensitive. And so if the insurance industry prices insurance and raises premiums on fire zone properties and incentivizes adaptation investment, this is a way to fuel resilience. There's sort of two dimensions to pessimism. One could be a pessimist who says, I don't think that we can adapt to the punches Mother Nature's throwing. A second dimension of pessimism is those who say, we're not reducing greenhouse gas emissions fast enough. And so I think we want to unpack both of those. I run into many young people who are very concerned that they won't have as good a life as their parents and are concerned that climate change will be the cause of this. What I want to say is the following. I want young people, including my son, to be pessimistic enough that they're worried and thus are willing to vote their pocketbook on the green economy. But I don't want them to be so worried that this paralyzes them and makes them feel that life isn't worth living. Something we learn, or I have learned in my economics training, is yes, we face the laws of physics, but we can always devise new incentives, new rules of the game to improve our quality of life. If we faced higher water prices that reflected the scarcity of water in drought, the American West, everyone would plant drought resistant uh, outdoor vegetation, and aggregate water demand would shrink among urbanites. If farmers faced higher water prices to reflect scarcity, they wouldn't be growing alfalfa in California. They grow alfalfa because they face artificially low water prices. So, a key theme in my book is if we allow prices to reflect scarcity, capitalism starts to work in favor of helping us to adapt. I've worked in Singapore, and Singapore has no traffic congestion because they have road pricing. Singapore charges you at rush hour, you got to pay more to use the roads. There's been great progress in climate science of identifying what are geographical areas that will face heat waves, what are geographical areas that will face flooding and wildfire risk. If we can identify those parcels of land that are relatively safer, if we can upzone in those places, more people can live there. And so those are all examples of adaptation-friendly policies. I have a whole chapter in the book focused that the poor face the greatest challenges in adapting to climate change. That when you're poor, you live in the riskiest places, you have access to the lowest quality housing, lower quality food, lower quality healthcare. So what I would support, and I think many economists would support, is Milton Friedman's idea for universal basic income. The way I would have the Biden administration set this up is I would support universal basic income, and people like me should be taxed to provide this. But then I don't want to see subsidies for other prices because we need a safety net for the poor that does not distort incentives. When there's extreme heat in Phoenix, it's the homeless who are at risk to die from that heat. It is not people who are playing golf that day. What environmental justice advocates are correct about is the brunt of the costs of shocks are borne by poor people in poor cities. We published a paper last year, we released it as an NBR working paper, that when hurricanes hit American cities, it's poor cities and Black cities that are hurt the worst by these shocks. And this is an example of how climate change exacerbates environmental justice challenges. And so I think that's a very important point. And I think that all optimists have to acknowledge that point, that in a Rawlsian sense, the poor and disadvantaged groups will disproportionately bear the costs of Mother Nature's punches. And so that point has to be acknowledged. So I sort of had two goals in writing this book. I think that environmentalists have been overly pessimistic about our standard of living because they've underappreciated our capacity to adapt. And without engaging in wishful thinking, my book is meant to confront readers with an intellectual argument as a source of optimism, not blind wishful thinking, but of optimism about how a free market evolves to help us cope with those challenges we face. When we face climate change, we need to have more options. And I'll give an example I talk about in my book. I don't want people to own their own houses anymore. I want them to be renters. Because if we're renters, we rent our house from a professional management company who has the human capital and the financial capital to better deal with climate change risks. And if we're renters, we can always move away. If you live in a beautiful area, but you're worried it faces greater fire risk, as a renter, you can just say, we're not going to renew our lease. We're out of here. The key to unleashing capitalism to protect our environment is for consumers to vote their pocketbook on issues that they're passionate about and to let prices reflect scarcity. And so what I want students to think about is how do we achieve the best pieces of capitalism, of innovation, and of expanding our menu of choice without unleashing the inequality that we've seen in the past. And I think that concern about inequality is very valid. And I think that the Biden administration's policies, which will raise my taxes, offer many benefits because if the Biden administration succeeds in convincing young people that we can have the best parts of capitalism while taming some of its excesses, then that's actually terrific. Going forward, if we have new rules of the game that signal scarcity and give us more freedom to reoptimize, we'll be better able to adapt to climate change. And so that's a big theme of the book.